Let's go further in depth now. We're joined by Glenn Cohen, a Harvard law professor, director of the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. He's also the author of the book, Patients with Passports, Medical Tourism Law and Ethics. He's Skyping in from Miami today. And here on our anchor desk, Newsmax Deputy Health Editor Nick Tate. Gentlemen, to you both, we thank you for your time. Mr. Cohen, we'll get to the nurse and the troops in just a minute, but a new poll of voters is part of the site lead of our website from our parent company, Newsmax.com. It says 4 in 10 Americans do not trust the federal government to handle the Ebola threat. 4 in 10 believe an Ebola outbreak is likely in our nation. Can we credit our government's consistently inconsistent message for that?
Well, I think you're exactly right that there's been huge inconsistency on the part of the administration. You have CDC saying one thing, and you have Chuck Hagel saying something else as to the troops. And I think it's no wonder that the American public has mistrust. Of the two, although Chuck Hagel thinks his policy is scientifically grounded, I actually think it's not. And if you look at the New England Journal of Medicine this past week, they unanimously declare that when you are asymptomatic, when you are not running a fever, there is no way for you to transmit Ebola. And his policy would basically quarantine everyone, whether they're showing any symptoms, whether they're showing any fever. In that respect, I think it's an overreaction, and the American public are reacting to that overreaction.
Well, Glenn says, Nick, you heard him there, it's an overreaction, but he also says the government policy is inconsistent. Your take?
Well, I think when you have a patchwork of recommendations, as we have now in this country, you do feed the fear. We've got 9 states that are going independent of the CDC recommendations because they don't believe the CDC recommendations are strong enough. In the case of New York and Maine and New Jersey, these 21-day quarantines are required. We have the Pentagon saying one thing. We have the CDC saying it's a case-by-case basis. And when we have the level of fear in this country, whether it's grounded in science or not, it's real. I think the fact that the federal government is speaking with multiple voices out of different sides of the federal government's mouth, then it's going to generate even more fear. We need a more consistent policy. Everybody needs to be on the same page.
Glenn, let me get back to you. You were saying just a second ago, you cited the New England Journal of Medicine and asymptomatic conditions, saying that this kind of military quarantine you don't believe to be necessary. But in terms of public health, we look back 40 years when the Apollo moon crews came home. We kept them in isolation, concerned about some sort of lunar superbug. What's the difference? I don't see why the military should not be quarantined. Explain to me that.
I mean, one thing is when you're talking about pathogens from outer space, we have no experience or expertise about that. When you're talking about Ebola, this has been around since 1976. We know about it. We know about it at the PCR, the molecular level. We also know about it in terms of what's been going on in West Africa for the past 4 months. There is no documented evidence that it can be transmitted when someone is not running a fever, when someone is asymptomatic. And really, the reason for that as a medical matter is the level of virus, the viral load, the viral shedding is just not enough. And if it was just a matter of all things being equal, let's be extra careful, it would be one thing. But the problem is you have Doctors Without Borders, among others, complaining that when you threaten...
We're having a little problem with Nick's feed. Let me come back, or pardon, with Glenn's feed. Nick, let me come back to you. Doesn't peace of mind account for something in terms of public health?
Well, I think in this case, Glenn is right that what we know about Ebola to date suggests that you have to be symptomatic before you can spread this disease, and you have to have exposure to bodily fluids. But there have been something like 300 mutations in the current strain of Ebola that's at the center of the outbreak, which says that, in fact, it mutates. So what we've known about Ebola in the past may no longer be true about Ebola in the current and the present, so you have to take precautions and be careful.
One thing's true, we are governed by time. We're out of it for this segment. We're going to ask you both to hang around. We'll talk more about Ebola here on America.